Hey guys, tonight we slip into a story where smoke lingers longer than memory. Picture this. It's July 12th, 1979. The Brooklyn heat presses down like a velvet glove dipped in sweat. Somewhere in Bushwick, 3 men sit at a patio table shaded by a grapevine arbor. On that table, eggplant parmigiana, cold beer, pistachios in cracked bowls, and at the head, relaxed and halfway through his meal, is Carmine Galante, the man whose name still sends ripples through Mafia folklore. He's got that trademark cigar clenched between his teeth, not lit, never lit, just resting there like a lazy crown. You might even say the cigar's more alive than he is in the next few seconds, because here's the truth. Someone's about to pull a trigger. Not once, not twice. The meal will stay warm, the wine will spill quietly. But the man himself, he will never finish that sentence he was midway through. And if you think you'd survive 1 hour in his shoes, or in his leather loafers custom made from Palermo, you probably wouldn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The garden was quiet that day, suspiciously so. Bushwick's usual background noises, kids yelling, car alarms hiccuping, somebody's Cumbia radio pulsing through a second-story window, were softened, distant. The sun filtered through trellised vines in a haze, dappling the brick wall behind the trio. Galante, seated comfortably in his pale blue short-sleeved shirt, leaned back in his chair, exhaling the air of a man not easily rattled. To his right sat Leonard Coppola, his loyal Sicilian associate, muscular build, still in his 30s, with a permanent frown. On the left, Cesare Bonventre, another Sicilian, leaner, quieter, eyes like polished slate. They were the kind of men who walked into a room like they owned the lease, and today, their movements had been slow, almost too slow. But Galante didn't notice, or didn't care. The man had made enemies of nearly everyone who wore silk in downtown Manhattan. Yet here he was, eating lunch in the open, shirt collar undone, cigar perched like punctuation. Moments before the bullets flew, Galante reached for a piece of bread. His fingers touched crust. His lips held the cigar like a joke he wasn't telling. And then, movement. 3 men stepped into the yard. Fast, methodical, faces uncovered. One of them raised a sawed-off shotgun. Another had a .38 revolver. There were no warnings, no shouted names, just the mechanical cough of steel. The first blast hit Leonard Coppola in the chest. He slumped forward instantly. Cesare Bonventre didn't flinch. In fact, some say he even stepped back, leaving space. Galante turned his head just in time to see the barrel aimed straight at his chest. 2 shots cracked the air. A third one took out part of his jaw. His body jerked, then settled. The cigar remained between his teeth, unlit, oddly pristine. Within 10 seconds, it was over. The gunman exited calmly, as if heading to a lunch date. One of them even adjusted his cuff. Across the street, a woman named Maria, a seamstress who always stitched with the radio on, told police later that she thought fireworks were going off. After all, it was summer, and in Brooklyn, no one really paid attention to sudden bangs anymore. But when she peered out her 3rd-floor window and saw the slumped figures, she knew it wasn't fireworks. It was punctuation. When the paramedics arrived, they didn't rush. There was nothing to save. Galante's blood had soaked into the grout between patio tiles. a red map of his last afternoon. His cigar, still there, like an insult, like a signature. That photograph, yes, that photograph, circulated within hours. Galante, seated, slumped, mouth ajar, cigar still in place. It was almost too perfect. Mafia insiders didn't flinch when they saw it. Some even smiled. Galante had lived like he dined, with confidence, arrogance, and no apologies. But now, the table was clear. The seat was empty. And the question floated in the air like tobacco smoke. Who ordered the hit? Many people still think the commission voted unanimously. Others say it was internal betrayal, bon ventre perhaps, playing both sides. Some even suggest it was Galante's mouth that did him in, not because he talked to the feds, but because he talked down to everyone else. Whatever the reason, that lunch didn't just end a life. It cracked open a story, a legacy, a legend built from cigar ash and kitchen tiles. And like any good underworld tale, it began not with a rise, but with a birth. So now, let's rewind the reel. Back to Harlem, back to the early 1900s, before the smoke, before the betrayal, before the rooftop. Carmine Galante is not yet the cigar. He's just a boy. Small hands, big eyes, knees scuffed from alley chases. The world he's born into doesn't offer much, but it whispers. Harlem, in 1910, is chaos with rhythm. A street organ here, a Yiddish curse there. Italian mothers hanging laundry above a street preacher warning about hellfire. And somewhere in this noise is a family of Sicilian immigrants, the Galantes, trying to hold on to honor in a city that spits out dreamers and chews up loyalty like yesterday's pasta. His father, Vincenzo, works as a fisherman turned laborer. His mother, Napolitana, speaks to him in dialects so thick it takes years before Carmine truly understands English. But language isn't what shapes him. It's silence. Young Carmine learns quickly that the quiet ones survive. He watches, listens, memorizes who argues with whom, and who always wins. He sees that the man who nods rather than shouts usually walks home with his nose unbroken. These observations will serve him well. Decades later, he'll nod his way through million-dollar drug deals. At 10, he's skipping school. At 12, he's running errands for local wise guys. At 14, he breaks a kid's nose with the smooth side of a pocket knife, not because he wants to, but because the kid asked if Carmine's father cried at work. The message is sent. Carmine doesn't need to send it twice. By 15, the police have a file on him. Petty theft, assault, truancy. But no one really knows what to do with him. He's not a brute. He's polite, oddly quiet. And he always looks people in the eye, even when they threaten him. His teachers write him off as unteachable. His neighborhood writes him in as a future problem. But somewhere in that blur of adolescence and asphalt, Carmine Galante makes a choice. Not to rise quickly, not to burn fast. He will study the shadows. He will become the smoke. The streets of East Harlem in the early 1920s are no place for hesitation. For Carmine Galante, now pushing 17, those cracked sidewalks and fire escape ladders have become his syllabus, his battleground, and his playground. There are no textbooks on how to earn respect when your shoes have holes and your name gets muttered like a warning. But Carmine's been taking notes for years, on the streets, in the backs of bodegas, and in the slurred confessions of older boys nursing broken noses. By this time, he's made himself useful to the right people. Mostly runners, bookmakers, and a few small-time muscle types who see in Carmine a different breed. Less bark, more bite. He isn't flashy, doesn't bother with loud suits or fast cars yet, but the people who matter start to notice the way he handles problems, quietly, efficiently, and without repeating himself. His first serious arrest comes at 17. It's a robbery, technically, though those who knew the story will tell you it was more like an unsanctioned collection job gone sideways. He didn't just rob someone, he robbed the wrong someone. Or rather, the right someone, depending on whose side you were on. Either way, Carmine's looking at time, reform school, lockup, and here's where the story gets interesting. Not because of what he does, but because of what he doesn't. He doesn't cry. He doesn't plead. Doesn't offer excuses to the judge, who stares down from the bench like he's swatting flies. Carmine just stands there, still as stone, his hands folded in front of him like he's at mass. One detective later recalled, "The kid looked like he was waiting to be knighted, not sentenced. Inside, he thrives." Reform school is a pressure cooker for most boys. For Carmine, it's a library with barbed wire. He keeps to himself, listens more than he speaks, and makes exactly one friend, a quiet boy from the Bronx who teaches him rudimentary French. In exchange, Carmine teaches him how to throw a punch that doesn't need a second. He learns more than languages behind bars. He learns about rhythm, how certain guards take longer breaks, how the kitchen deliveries are staggered, how everyone moves in predictable loops. It's his first glimpse of systems, and Galante begins to realize that the world isn't ruled by power alone. It's ruled by timing. Back on the outside, the world has changed a little. The streets are rougher, the bootlegging trade has grown teeth, and the people he once called mentors now bow to men with heavier names and bloodier histories. That's when Salvatore Maranzano's name enters his orbit. Now, Maranzano isn't your run-of-the-mill neighborhood boss. He's not a corner bookie or a bodega backroom type. He's Sicilian, old school, with a fondness for Roman history and a vision for reorganizing the mob like Caesar did his legions. Galante, still in his early 20s, catches his attention, not by shouting for it, but by keeping his mouth shut when everyone else is bragging about the jobs they've done. One night, in a private room above a bakery, Maranzano calls him in. Carmine enters wearing his best second-hand suit, borrowed from a cousin, sleeves slightly too short. Maranzano doesn't look up from his glass of wine. He gestures to the seat. Carmine sits. There are no pleasantries, no smiles. "You don't talk much," Maranzano says in Sicilian. "I listen," Carmine replies. "It's enough." The old man nods. A test passed. From that point on, Galante becomes something more than an errand boy. He's not officially inducted. Those ceremonies come later. But he's inside now, or at least close enough to feel the heat. And he's assigned tasks. Some legal, most not. One of those tasks is simple. Drive a car. That's it. Show up at a certain corner in Manhattan, drive a black coupe to a designated location, and wait. Don't ask questions. Don't look in the rearview mirror. He does it, then does it again, and again, until the ride ends one day in 1931 with the assassination of Salvatore Maranzano himself. It's one of the most pivotal moments in Mafia history. Maranzano, who fancied himself the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, is gunned down in his office by men pretending to be IRS agents. The job is widely believed to have been orchestrated by Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who wanted to move the mob away from old country rules and into a more American model of business. Did Carmine Galante drive one of the cars used in the hit? Maybe. Did he know who was inside? Harder to say. Many people still think he played a role, not as a shooter, but as a silent wheelman, trusted to keep the engine warm and his mouth cold. If true, It's one of the most understated, yet significant roles a young man could play in underworld history. Not because he pulled a trigger, but because he was trusted to witness the smoke and say nothing. The hit sends ripples through the underworld. The old system collapses. Luciano's commission rises, and Carmine Galante? He doesn't rise to power. Yet. He does something smarter. He disappears. For nearly a decade, Galante fades from front pages, police reports, and enemy ledgers. It's not that he stops working. It's that he stops being seen. He learns to delegate, to operate from the corners, to build networks that don't rely on visibility. He becomes, in essence, a ghost with a bankroll, but not everyone forgets him. His legend simmers. And by the 1940s, when heroin begins to trickle into New York in new and dangerous ways, it's Galante's name whispered among port authorities, customs agents, and mid-level traffickers. He isn't flashy, doesn't show up in mink or Cadillacs, but the operations bearing his fingerprints run like clockwork. And always, he has a cigar nearby. Not lit, just there, a signal perhaps, or a superstition. But if you ask him about it, he'll say, "Cigars are for men who don't need to explain themselves." And then he'll smile, just once, before the silence returns. By the mid-1940s, the New York underworld is beginning to change shape, and so is Carmine Galante. He's no longer just the young wheelman who kept quiet. He's becoming something more elusive, a figure whose movements ripple through multiple boroughs without a single confirmed sighting. You hear his name in whispered transactions behind butcher counters, in coded phone calls between Montreal and Manhattan, in the back booths of espresso bars where no one stirs their cup until the conversation ends. And yet, for all this power, Galante is still officially a nobody. No title, no official place in the Bonanno family's hierarchy. But titles, as it turns out, are overrated. Influence isn't measured by ceremony, it's measured by silence. And Galante's silence, it speaks volumes. His base of operation, if you could call it that, is a rotating triangle of modest addresses: an apartment in Bushwick, a warehouse in Williamsburg, a flower shop with 2 sets of books. From the outside, nothing glamorous. But on the inside, the hum of cash, the shuffle of couriers, the scent of heavy spice in the air from crates that don't just carry oregano. One constant in this period is his deepening connection with Montreal. While many crime families are still tangled in local turf wars, Galante looks beyond. He sees in Canada a cleaner channel, a border that's more suggestion than barrier, and a port city teeming with opportunity. Montreal, with its French-Italian enclaves and under-policed harbors, becomes a second home. Not physically. Galante doesn't need to travel much. He sends others, trustworthy men with accents thick as glue and suitcases lined in false bottoms. This is where the real story of heroin begins. Not the cheap, erratic supply of street-level pushers, but a global pipeline, the French connection. Laboratories in Marseille, distribution in Canada, sales in the US. It's a business model designed like a symphony, every note timed, every delivery precise. Galante doesn't invent the system, but he sees how to perfect it. Back in New York, the Bonanno family benefits, on paper. But the truth? Galante's playing a separate game. The profits move through his hands. The Sicilian foot soldiers who handle transit, storage, and protection are loyal to him, not the family's boss of record. He's building a substructure, a faction within a faction, one that doesn't ask permission. By 1949, Galante has become essential and untouchable. When rivals try to interfere with his couriers, things happen. Quiet things. A warehouse catches fire. A customs officer resigns. A cousin's son disappears on his way home from school. But Galante doesn't gloat. He doesn't throw parties. He doesn't even buy a new car. He buys silence. There's one detail from this era that sticks in people's memories, though. A small scene, easily missed. He's at a cafe on Mott Street, sipping espresso with an old friend. The waiter, a kid new to the job, approaches nervously. He asks Galante if he'd like cream. Galante lifts his eyes slowly, says nothing for a long moment. Then, "No, I don't dilute things." It's a throwaway line, but the waiter never forgets it. Years later, he tells a reporter that moment convinced him to switch to tea. Now, while all this is happening, federal agents are beginning to piece things together. They don't have hard evidence, but the pattern's clear. Galante's name pops up beside heroin busts in Toronto, near a firebombed storage facility in Buffalo, behind a coded ledger seized in New Jersey. Still, no one touches him. Part of that is fear, but part of it is confusion. How does a man with no title command this kind of operation? Many people still think Galante was given unofficial clearance by the Bonannos, allowed to act as he pleased as long as the profits flowed upward. Others argue he was always independent, only pretending loyalty while quietly preparing to take over the whole show. So what do you think? Was he a faithful servant or a silent usurper? Whatever the truth, one thing becomes increasingly evident. Galante isn't just doing business. He's building a legacy. And his tools aren't just money or muscle, they're people. His crew is hand-picked, drawn largely from Sicily. Young men brought over with promises of loyalty, opportunity, and a strict code. They don't speak out of turn. They don't drink in public. They dress like undertakers and walk like priests. And they answer only to him. Among them is a name that will matter later. Cesare Bonventre. Thin, sharp-eyed, with a calm that unnerves even seasoned captains. He's barely out of his teens when Galante first brings him over, but he quickly becomes a favored lieutenant. Not because he's flashy, but because he listens. Galante always values listeners. And then there's the cigar. By now, it's as much a part of him as his shadow. Always unlit, always perched between his teeth or fingers. Some say it's a superstition, that lighting it would invite bad luck. Others believe it's strategy. Without smoke, there's no distraction, no veil, just the symbol. The suggestion of heat, a smoldering threat. Photographs from this era confirm it. Galante at a table, surrounded by food, drink, and bodyguards. Cigar in place. Eyes somewhere far away, like he's already decided how you'll die if you cross him. But he doesn't shout, doesn't boast. When meetings happen, often in the back of a pizzeria or a florist's cold room, Galante speaks softly. In Sicilian, mostly. Sometimes in French. Always calm. It's said that one FBI agent, after tailing him for weeks, wrote in a report, "Subject speaks rarely, eats often, smiles only with the eyes." Meanwhile, the world beyond the Mafia is shifting. The Vietnam War is heating up. Heroin addiction is surging in American cities. The DEA is born, and narcotics become a national obsession. But Galante? He remains a ghost in the margins, untouched, unknown to most Americans, but deeply known to anyone whose business depends on supply chains that don't exist on paper. By the early 1950s, the Bonannos begin to worry, not because Galante is failing, but because he's succeeding too well. He's not just profiting from heroin, he's controlling it. And worse, he's not asking permission. This is the beginning of tension. Not open conflict, yet, but murmurs. doubts. Ledger entries that don't quite add up. Questions asked and answered with shrugs. But Galante doesn't flinch. He continues to eat, to nod, to chew slowly while others argue. And when someone asks about the growing scrutiny from law enforcement, he replies, "They're chasing smoke. I'm already the fire." By the late 1950s, Galante is no longer a whisper in the wind. He's the calm in the center of a hurricane. Quiet but vast. Calculated but unpredictable. Most men his age are climbing ladders one rung at a time. Galante, he's been building his own staircase in the dark for 2 decades. And now, the steps lead straight to an empire stitched together with heroin, loyalty, and fear. The Bonanno family, technically his employer, begins to find itself in a strange position. Galante is technically under Joseph Bonanno, the boss. But everyone, from street captains in Queens to traffickers in Marseille, knows who really runs the narcotics division. The commission doesn't say his name much, but when it does, it's spoken with the caution you'd use around a wasp nest. In 1958, Galante is called before a Senate committee investigating organized crime. It's his first real appearance on the national radar. Cameras flash. Reporters lean forward, hungry for a soundbite. They get nothing. He shows up in a dark suit, pinstripe so subtle it might as well be whispered. His hands folded in front of him, face impassive. The committee chair asks if he knows anything about the narcotics traffic coming from Europe. Galante blinks. Once. Slowly. I decline to answer, on the grounds that it may incriminate me. He repeats that line, again and again. For hours. Later that week, one journalist writes, "Galante may be the most boring witness in history, unless you know how to read between lines. The thing is, Galante isn't there to perform. He doesn't want to prove his innocence or charm the room. He wants them to forget him the moment he leaves. Invisibility, after all, is armor. The louder bosses, Costello, Anastasia, Genovese, they all became targets eventually. Galante plans to be the man no one sees coming. Back on the streets, he's busy refining the heroin network. The Corsican labs in Marseille are producing at record speed. Montreal serves as the primary funnel. And the US distribution? That's Galante's masterpiece. He builds it like a utility company. Every part insulated from the next. Couriers don't know suppliers. Mid-level handlers never meet financiers. And everyone reports only to Galante or one of his hand-picked lieutenants. It's called compartmentalization, and it makes the whole structure nearly bulletproof. One DEA agent at the time refers to the network as a ghost pipeline. You know the product's moving, but you can't find the taps. Galante's methods are surgical. He uses bakeries to hide shipments, pasta crates packed with rubber-wrapped bricks, flower shops with walls double-layered to hold envelopes. Even a funeral parlor becomes a node, because who checks a hearse? And always the pattern remains. Quiet, consistent, untraceable. He doesn't tolerate mistakes. When a courier in Jersey City loses a package, just one, he disappears. No public lesson. No message scrawled in blood. Just gone. Erased like a chalkboard. Galante doesn't need theatrics. Fear is more efficient when it's implied. Now, around this time, an interesting thing happens. The commission, essentially the board of directors for the Mafia, begins to take a closer look at the narcotics trade. They've always known it's a gold mine, but they also know it attracts heat. Most bosses try to stay one layer removed from it. They invest through proxies, deny involvement, claim the money comes from construction, vending machines, dry cleaning. Galante, he leans in. He doesn't care that narcotics are taboo. Doesn't care about tradition. He sees profit, scale, inevitability. And this makes him dangerous, not just to law enforcement, but to other bosses. Because here's the thing. Galante isn't pretending to play the old game anymore. He's rewriting the rules. While others still talk in codes and meet in church basements, he takes calls openly, scribbles numbers on napkins, discusses shipments with the tone of a man ordering fresh mozzarella. He's not reckless, just certain. In 1960, things catch up to him, at least on the surface. He's indicted on federal narcotics charges tied to a massive international ring. The evidence isn't perfect, but it's loud enough. Witnesses, paper trails, phone records. Galante, of course, denies everything. He hires good lawyers, wears a small smile in court. That cigar? Still there, still unlit. A judge, watching him from the bench, notes, "He didn't look worried. He looked like someone waiting for coffee." Eventually, Galante is convicted. 15 years in federal prison. But if you think this stops him, you haven't been paying attention, because Carmine Galante treats prison the way most people treat airports, a temporary inconvenience with bad coffee and occasional delays. He uses the time wisely, reads, reconnects with old allies, sharpens his French, writes coded letters. From behind bars, he continues to manage the network. Not directly, he's not foolish, but through a web of intermediaries, many of whom don't even know they're acting on his instructions. There's a story from his time in prison that still floats around. A new inmate, unaware of who Galante is, makes a joke about his height. Galante was never a tall man. A few days later, the inmate slips in the shower, hard, breaks 2 ribs. Nobody sees what happens. But that night, Galante gets an extra dessert with his dinner tray. Coincidence? Maybe. During these years, he begins mentoring a few younger men, quietly, carefully. He's not running classes or holding court in the yard, but the right people find their way to him. Men who are patient, men who ask intelligent questions. One of them, later known as a mid-level boss in New Jersey, recalls, "Galante never told you what to do. He asked you what you thought, and if you were wrong, you'd feel it." By 1974, Galante is released early for good behavior. He's older, a little grayer, but the cigar, still there. Outside, the landscape has changed. The Bonanno family is splintered. The heroin trade is under federal siege. Old allies are gone. Some dead, some flipped, some just tired. But Galante? He's not just back. He's hungry, and he's not here to take orders anymore. He's here to finish what he started. When Carmine Galante steps back into the world in 1974, he does so like a man arriving at his own funeral, uninvited, unsmiling, and completely in control. The city has changed. The skyline looks more polished. Crime is less visible, but no less vicious. And the Bonanno family he once danced around is now hollowed out, its leadership eroded by years of infighting and federal pressure. But Galante doesn't blink. If anything, he seems more focused, more confident. He walks out of prison leaner than expected, sharp-eyed, with a thin mustache that somehow softens and sharpens his face all at once. His suits are darker, tailored tighter, and his cigar, still unlit, returns to its familiar perch, clenched just off-center like a punctuation mark in a long sentence he's not yet finished writing. At first, there's uncertainty. Other families watch his return with caution. Some think he'll fade into retirement, open a restaurant, play the quiet consigliere in his twilight years. But that was never his style. Retirement? That's for accountants, not architects of narcotics empires. Instead, Galante starts making moves. Not loud ones, he's not a street-level brawler, but precise, surgical actions. He visits old haunts, has quiet lunches with mid-tier captains, offers to consult on certain shipments that have been mysteriously held up at the border. Within months, he's back in the heart of the heroin pipeline. The Sicilian supply chain, rattled during his prison stint, begins humming again. His name resurfaces in Montreal. Mid-level traffickers start reporting to him out of habit, instinct, or fear. It's hard to say which. Joseph Bonanno, now mostly out of the picture, watches from Arizona with mild amusement. Galante isn't seizing power by force. He's simply acting like it's already his. And most of the family doesn't push back. The alternative, infighting, chaos, uncertainty, is worse. In many ways, they welcome the order, but not everyone's happy. The commission, composed of the bosses from the 5 families, is growing wary. Galante is not only reasserting control over the Bonannos, he's expanding the heroin trade with alarming confidence. Even worse, he's doing it without consultation, without the usual handshakes, envelopes, and nods of permission. And there's something else, something that gnaws at the other dons more than money or territory. Galante is unpredictable. He dines in public, takes meetings in broad daylight, walks the streets with a swagger that feels less like tradition and more like defiance. And always, he brings the cigar. It's in every photo now, every surveillance shot, a quiet taunt to law enforcement and rivals alike. Many people still think that if Galante had played things a little softer, curbed his ambition just slightly, he might have been allowed to rule indefinitely. But subtlety was never his strong suit, not when it came to power. In 1975, something shifts. He stops waiting for approval. He starts calling himself the acting boss of the Bonanno family, not officially, not with ceremony, but in private meetings, it's understood. If you want heroin, you go through him. If you have a dispute in Brooklyn, you clear it with him. If you have a problem with that, well, you'd better keep it to yourself. Galante's confidence is now total. He's the captain of a ship no one else remembers steering. He reorganizes the family's operations, doubling down on heroin while minimizing exposure in more visible rackets like gambling or construction. He even begins to siphon off trusted men to handle overseas logistics, Italian nationals, often undocumented, who answer directly to him. They're called zips, slang for zip guns, meaning fast, deadly, and not traceable. To Galante, they're perfect soldiers. No connections to other New York crews. No loyalty beyond what he buys or inspires. And most importantly, they speak his language, Sicilian, in every sense of the word. He builds his own internal network, parallel to the Bonanno family, but separate, a shadow within the organization. And through this, he consolidates real power. By 1976, Galante is running a massive heroin empire with international reach. Sicilian chemists, Canadian importers, American distributors, all connected through invisible threads he's been weaving since the 1940s. He keeps a low profile publicly. No press interviews, no flamboyant birthday parties. But within the underworld, he becomes a myth. A man whose presence in a room could drop the temperature 5 degrees, who could nod once and have an entire operation rerouted within 24 hours. Law enforcement is, of course, paying attention. The DEA has files inches thick on him. They bug his restaurants, tail his drivers, flip his couriers, but nothing sticks. He speaks in coded language, avoids phones, and uses layers of intermediaries to shield himself from the product. There's a famous moment, possibly apocryphal but believed by many, when a federal agent tailing Galante's driver swears the Don vanished in broad daylight. One moment, he's walking into a meat market. 10 seconds later, gone. No back exit, no tunnel. Just gone. That's when I knew, the agent said later. We weren't dealing with a normal mobster. We were dealing with a ghost in a cigar. The commission grows increasingly unsettled. They don't fear his ambition. They fear his independence. Galante isn't just acting like a boss. He's ignoring the old rules, sidestepping protocols, taking meetings in Montreal without clearing it, shipping heroin through routes not approved by the commission, keeping the profits quiet. And most dangerously, he's bringing in outsiders. The Sicilian zips he imports are viewed with suspicion. They don't play by New York rules. They don't respect the existing chain of command. They respect Galante, and Galante alone. Tension rises. At a sit-down in late 1977, representatives from the other families quietly raise the topic. Galante is too loud, too bold, too powerful, but no consensus is reached. Not yet. He's useful after all. Heroin is profitable, and Galante is the architect. But even architects, when they stop following blueprints, become liabilities. So what do you think? Was Galante just ahead of his time? A businessman in a tradition-bound world unwilling to modernize? Or was he, as many whisper, a tyrant in tailored suits, a man who mistook fear for respect and cigars for crowns? The answer, like Galante himself, won't be easy to catch. By 1978, Carmine Galante is no longer operating in shadows. He's fully stepped into the light, and not because he's careless, but because he believes, with a kind of terrifying certainty, that no one can touch him. He dines openly in Brooklyn cafes. He hosts strategy meetings in the backs of pizza parlors. He walks down the street like a mayor in a city no one voted him to rule. No bodyguards flank him, at least none who stand out. And always, always, that cigar, firm between his teeth, not lit, not needed. It says everything he doesn't. I'm still here. There's an edge to him now, a sharper stare, a sense that he's not simply trying to consolidate power. He's declaring war on complacency. The 5 families, the old commission, the agreed-upon hierarchies. In Galante's eyes, they're relics. He doesn't need to ask for permission. He is the business, but those around him are beginning to sense the imbalance. Inside the Bonanno family, grumblings grow. The Sicilian zips Galante relies on are seen as intruders, men who answer to no one but him, who don't understand the quiet nuances of New York's mob code. They're efficient, sure, but they're also loyal to Sicily, not to the boroughs. Galante brushes it off. He's playing a bigger game. Heroin continues flowing through his channels like oil through a pipe. The Marseille labs remain humming. Montreal, ever reliable, serves as a checkpoint and staging ground. The U.S. distribution machine, run by men with no last names and no public addresses, spins like a well-oiled carousel, and all of it, in some shape or form, feeds back into Galante's accounts. And those accounts? They're not just in the Bronx anymore. Rumors swirl that Galante has begun laundering money through banks in Panama, through real estate deals in Miami, and through shell companies registered to elderly cousins no one's heard from in decades. He's diversifying, not just his trade routes, but his safety nets. Still, with success comes paranoia. Galante tightens his circle. Meetings become shorter, conversations more guarded. Associates who once dined with him weekly now wait days for a return call. His trust, already rare, becomes microscopic. Only the zips seem immune. There's one man, however, who remains close, Cesare Bonventre. Remember him? The young Sicilian Galante brought over years ago. Now a full-fledged enforcer, quiet and calculating. He barely speaks at meetings, but when he does, people lean in. His presence, much like Galante's, commands respect without demanding it. Many believe Bonventre is being groomed to eventually succeed Galante, not as boss of the Bonanno family necessarily, but as heir to the empire Galante has carved inside it. If that happens, it would mark a seismic shift. Power would tilt not just to a new face, but to a new kind of face, one rooted in Sicily, not New York. This, more than anything, unsettles the commission. It isn't just about drugs anymore. It's about control, about heritage, about what the American Mafia is, and who gets to define it. Behind closed doors, meetings intensify. Galante's name is mentioned more and more, often followed by long silences. Other bosses, quietly, cautiously, start to float an idea. Maybe he's gone too far. Maybe it's time to rebalance things, but nothing's official. Not yet. Galante seems unfazed. He continues expanding. He even starts acquiring low-key political influence, donations to local campaigns, handshakes with city inspectors, quiet arrangements with union heads. He's not just building a crime empire. He's testing what it looks like to run a parallel government. Law enforcement tries to keep up. The DEA increases surveillance. FBI agents trail him from restaurant to restaurant. Bugs are placed in flower shops, wiretaps on phones, and still they can't touch him. Why? Because Galante doesn't say much. He doesn't write anything down. He doesn't attend large meetings or deal with unknown couriers. He plays chess without moving his queen, and that makes him invisible where it counts. There's a story from this period, a strange one. Galante is reportedly approached by a journalist writing a book on organized crime. The reporter asks for a quote. Just one line. Anything. Galante takes a long drag from his cigar. Then, without lighting it, he says, "The only thing I respect more than silence is fire, and I don't need both." He then walks away. The reporter never finishes the book. Now, back in Brooklyn, Galante's power is at its peak. He's feared, respected, even mythologized. Some of the younger guys call him the Pope, not for religious reasons, but because they say he's infallible. He doesn't make mistakes. But here's the thing about popes. They reign until others decide it's time for a new doctrine. And the commission? They've been holding their own little conclave. Somewhere in a quiet back room, a consensus is forming. It's time. Galante has disrupted the old order, bypassed too many rules, elevated foreign soldiers, cornered the heroin trade, and worst of all, he's done it while chewing a cigar and smirking like no one can touch him. That kind of confidence, it demands a correction. So what do you think? Was Galante's fall inevitable, written into the bones of the organization he defied? Or was it betrayal, plain and simple, from those too cowardly to match his ambition? Either way, the calendar turns. The year ticks forward, and somewhere in Bushwick, a lunch is being planned. The chairs are set, the wine is chilled, the sun is shining, and the seat at the head of the table, it's waiting. By the summer of 1979, Carmine Galante moves through the city like a man who knows how the story ends, and doesn't care. He walks with a calm, defiant rhythm, as if every sidewalk crack and bakery step belongs to him. There's no hesitation in his voice, no stutter in his actions. He isn't hiding, he isn't negotiating. He's simply existing in the full, unapologetic posture of power. His daily routines become rituals. Breakfast at the same table, short walks around the block, a stop at a neighborhood cafe where the espresso is always hot and the conversation always soft. He talks little, but when he does, it's with purpose. Brief, direct, and often final. There's no second guessing in Galante's world. You either understand the message, or you don't come back for the next one. And that cigar? Still there. Always. Even indoors. Even at funerals. Even in courtrooms. Tucked gently between fingers like a relic from a kingdom only he knows how to rule. But beneath the steady surface, the ground begins to shift. The commission has made up its mind. Galante's name has moved from murmurs to meetings to something far more serious. A decision, an agreement, a necessary subtraction. He's become a threat not just to profits, but to order. His independent heroin empire has disrupted the delicate balance of organized crime in New York. He's also become dangerously unyielding. You see, most bosses negotiate. They bend. They kiss rings. Galante doesn't. He ignores summons, declines sit-downs, refuses to cut anyone in. His Sicilian pipeline doesn't stop at the commission's door, and he's been stacking profits while everyone else debates protocol. That sort of behavior is tolerated for a while, but not forever. Still, no one moves on Galante lightly. He's too careful, too feared, too connected, not just in the U.S., but across the Atlantic. Whispers reach Palermo, where old men nod slowly at the mention of his name. In Montreal, his influence remains embedded in concrete, still untouched, still flowing. It takes more than one nod to greenlight a hit like this. It takes unanimity. And in mid-1979, that's exactly what they get. The Genovese, the Gambinos, the Colombos, the Lucchese's, even the fractured Bonanno family, tired of being steamrolled, all give the quiet go-ahead. But here's the twist. They won't do it themselves. Instead, they'll let Galante's own men carry it out. That's the plan. That's the poetry. The irony, of course, is that Galante always feared betrayal. That's why he surrounded himself with Sicilians, Zips, who didn't answer to New York power structures. But the thing about loyalty is, it's not binary. It's graded in shades of fear, ambition, debt, and survival. One of those shades? Cesare Bonventre. Yes, that Bonventre, the quiet one, the one Galante trusted most. His eyes and ears, the shadow behind the table. Now, sources still debate Bonventre's role. Was he in on it from the start? Or did he simply step aside at the right moment? Many people still think that deep down, Bonventre didn't want to betray Galante, but saw the writing on the wall. He could be loyal to a dead man or survive with the living. So what do you think? Back to Brooklyn. It's July 12th, 1979. Bushwick hums with slow heat. The kind of day where shirts cling and windows open reluctantly. Galante's lunch is planned for a modest back garden of Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant. A favorite spot, familiar, comfortable. Joining him are Leonard Coppola, a longtime associate, and Bonventre, the usual crew. No warnings, no signs, just lunch. Galante arrives dressed simply. Short sleeves, dark trousers, cigar already clamped in place. He orders light, eggplant, salad, a bit of red wine. There's small talk, laughter even. And then, like a change in weather, the rhythm shifts. 3 men enter the courtyard, 2 with pistols, 1 with a shotgun. Bonventre doesn't flinch. He doesn't run, doesn't shout. According to some accounts, he even steps back slightly, just enough to be out of the crossfire. The first shot tears through Coppola's chest. He collapses without finishing his wine. The second and third strike Galante. He jerks back in his chair, eyes wide, breath sharp, but he doesn't scream, doesn't fall forward. He exhales. Then the shotgun speaks. The blast catches Galante in the face, neck and upper chest pulverized. But here's the haunting detail. The cigar remains, wedged loosely between his teeth. A perfect symbol, a perfect photograph. The gunmen exit calmly. No masks, no rush. One reportedly adjusts his cufflink on the way out, like he's leaving a luncheon rather than a crime scene. Back inside, silence returns. A neighbor across the street swears they heard jazz playing faintly during the shooting. Others say the vines above the garden never even shook. By the time paramedics arrive, the scene is frozen. Galante reclines like he's napping. Coppola slumped forward, Bonventre gone, vanished before the first siren. The press arrives shortly after. Cameras flash, reporters jostle. The image hits the front page by morning. Galante, eyes half closed, shirt stained crimson, cigar intact. It becomes iconic, not just for its shock value, but because it says everything about Galante without needing a caption. He died the way he lived, calm, exposed, and entirely sure of his place at the table. No panic, no scrambling, just stillness. The commission never comments publicly. The Bonannos issue a vague statement about tragedy and misfortune, but in private, there are toasts, small silent ones, glasses raised, eyes low. The message is clear. Order has been restored. Galante's empire, of course, doesn't vanish. The heroin continues to flow. His lieutenants scatter, rebrand, or get absorbed. The Sicilian zips? Some disappear. Others adapt. Bonventre himself gains prominence for a time, until his own story comes due in a different backyard with different witnesses. And the legend of Galante? It doesn't fade. It calcifies. People debate his motives, his arrogance, his brilliance, his downfall. Some say he was too greedy. Others argue he was simply too bold for a system built on quiet deals and mutual restraint. But everyone agrees on one thing. That cigar? It never fell. The news of Carmine Galante's death spreads faster than any shipment he ever orchestrated. Within hours, the photograph is everywhere. New York tabloids splash it across their front pages like a Mafia postcard. Galante slumped, eyes open but lifeless, mouth slack with the unlit cigar still lodged between his teeth. If violence could be poetic, this was its haiku. And yet, despite the shock value, no one in the underworld seems particularly surprised. There are no public outcries, no messy retaliations, no week-long wakes with black Cadillacs lined up like mourners with parking permits. Just silence. Cool, respectful silence. As if the city, for all its noise, knows when a chapter has ended. Law enforcement springs into motion, but not because they're seeking justice. It's more like archaeology. They descend upon Galante's old haunts, interview known associates, sweep the back room of Joe and Mary's with forensic brushes. But nothing turns. No arrests, no weapons, no clear suspects. Everyone knows who did it, but no one says a word. It's the old code, reasserted by blood. The commission, unofficially, gets exactly what it wanted: balance. Galante's independent empire had become a rogue operation. His dominance over the heroin trade, while profitable, threatened the shared pie. He was squeezing out allies, favoring his own men, importing zips who operated outside New York's customs, and more dangerously, he was ignoring the conversation. That unwritten rule that the Mafia exists because of mutual tolerance. Galante wasn't tolerating anything, so now with him gone, what happens? The power vacuum he leaves behind doesn't stay empty long. The Bonanno family, fractured and jittery, regroups under new leadership. They make noise about restructuring, about going legitimate, about pulling back from heroin. But no one believes that for a second. The roots Galante established are too valuable, too entrenched. What changes isn't the trade. It's the face on the invoices, the name behind the phone call. In Montreal, the Canadians feel the loss more acutely. Galante had managed their connections like a conductor, keeping French Corsican smugglers in rhythm with Sicilian exporters and American distributors. Without him, timing stutters. trust wavers. New players step in, but none with Galante's vision or his patience. Meanwhile, the Zips, the Sicilian loyalists Galante cultivated like prized vines, scatter. Some retreat back to Italy. Others stay and swear fealty to whoever claims the next rung of power. A few vanish entirely, leaving behind apartments with half-cooked meals on the stove and closets still holding pressed suits. And Bonventre? Well, that's complicated. He keeps a low profile for a time. His name isn't shouted, but it lingers in the smoke of the aftermath. Many people still think he played both sides, loyal to Galante until the final lunch, then quietly stepping aside for the cleanup crew. There's one story, unconfirmed but persistent, that Bonventre attended Galante's funeral, standing at the very back of the chapel, hat low over his eyes, never speaking, never moving. When the service ended, he vanished before the last hymn finished echoing. If true, it says a lot about regret, about survival, about how quiet men make the loudest moves. Now the world moves on, sort of. The New York media, ever hungry for mythology, turns Galante into a posthumous icon. They write headlines like "The Don Who Died with Dessert" or "The Cigar Never Burned." He becomes a symbol, not just of mob violence, but of a time when criminals carried themselves like businessmen, and businessmen wore bulletproof vests to lunch. Hollywood takes note. Characters begin to appear, thinly veiled versions of Galante in films and TV dramas. Always with that cigar, always calm, always doomed. But those who knew him, truly knew him, remember something else. They remember his silences, his uncanny ability to stare through you and see exactly what you feared, his preference for quiet meetings over flashy shows, his refusal to compromise, not because he was stubborn, but because he thought compromise was just slow betrayal. There's a diner in Brooklyn where he once ate lunch weekly. The owners never changed the upholstery in his favorite booth. To this day, they keep the corner table open. No plaque, no photograph, just emptiness, like a breath being held. And yet there's still debate. Was Galante a visionary? A man ahead of his time who understood globalization before it became a boardroom buzzword? Or was he a tyrant in a short-sleeved shirt, so obsessed with control that he mistook fear for loyalty? So what do you think? The Commission, for all its consensus, never truly solved the problem Galante posed. They erased the man, but not the conditions that created him. The heroin trade continues. The Sicilian connections strengthen. And somewhere in an alley or a kitchen or a bakery back room, someone else is learning the same lessons Galante did. Watch more than you speak. Move before they see you. And never light the cigar until you're ready to burn the room down. And speaking of that cigar, it becomes more than a habit. It becomes a metaphor. For Galante, it wasn't about smoke. It was about presence. That stub of tobacco between his teeth said, "I'm in control. I'm not done yet. I'm always watching." Even in death, it stayed put. Like punctuation, like a period, like the end of a story that's still being told. In the weeks that follow Galante's assassination, New York hums with a strange kind of quiet. It's not peace, not relief. It's more like a city holding its breath. Because while Galante is gone, the echo of him lingers through the drug corridors, the whispered threats, and the lingering scent of espresso in backroom parlors. The Bonanno family, once disoriented and fractured, begins its slow crawl toward cohesion. A new acting boss is named Phil "Rusty" Rastelli, operating mostly from federal prison. On paper, it seems absurd, a Don managing an empire from behind bars. But this is the Mafia, after all, where titles often mean less than movement, and prisons are sometimes safer than boardrooms. Rastelli's elevation isn't organic, it's orchestrated. approved, in fact, by the same commission that authorized Galante's removal. They want order, predictability. Rastelli, with his reputation for diplomacy and back-channel loyalty, offers that. Galante, with his stubborn cigar and Sicilian army, never did. But here's the thing. Galante's systems don't collapse. His heroin routes, while shaken, survive. They were too efficient, too lucrative to abandon. Mid-tier distributors adjust, replacing his name with new ones. Some routes change hands, others go dark, then re-emerge under different umbrellas. But the architecture remains intact. Built so well, it doesn't need the architect anymore. It's a backhanded compliment to Galante's legacy. He died violently, but his empire continued without skipping a shipment. Meanwhile, law enforcement tries to seize the momentum. The DEA launches new task forces. The FBI dusts off old wiretap logs. Federal prosecutors issue sweeping statements about the fall of a heroin kingpin. But those inside the life, they know better. Galante's fall wasn't the end of heroin. It was the beginning of a new phase. Less centralized, more discreet, and ironically, more dangerous. There's one heroin seizure, months after his death, at the port of Newark. 200 pounds, hidden in barrels of olive oil. Agents find Galante's fingerprints nowhere near it, of course. But in a notebook recovered from one of the couriers, they find a scribbled phrase in Sicilian: Il fantasma non dorme. The ghost doesn't sleep. Was it a tribute, a warning, or just coincidence? Hard to say, but it fits. Now let's talk about that photograph again. The one of Galante, slumped in a patio chair, mouth ajar, with the cigar still nestled in place. It becomes legend, used in textbooks, on magazine covers, and eventually as a symbol of the Mafia's supposed decline. But what does it actually show? A man defiant to the end? A cautionary tale in pressed slacks? Or a reminder that no matter how high you climb, someone's always setting the table for your fall? Many people still think the image is staged. Too perfect. Too cinematic. But it wasn't. It was real. The photo wasn't taken by a tabloid photographer sneaking around a bush. It was snapped by the first NYPD officer to arrive on the scene. He said later, "I wasn't trying to make history. I just didn't want to forget the way he looked." And maybe that's the truest tribute of all, because for everything Galante was, brutal, brilliant, stubborn, visionary, he never once pretended to be anything but what he was. He didn't play for the cameras, didn't apologize, didn't explain. He just existed, on his terms, until someone else changed the terms. His funeral, quiet by Mafia standards, is held in a modest Bronx church. Few high-ranking figures attend. There's no grand procession, no weeping widow in black lace on the front page. Just a simple casket, a few relatives, and one old associate who, when asked by a reporter what Galante meant to the mob, simply said, "He was the flame. The rest of us, we just smoked around him." And yet, for all that fire, the final goodbye is surprisingly cold. No monument, no commemorative statue, just a plot at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, among other mob figures. The headstone is plain. No engraving of a cigar, no dramatic epitaph, just his name, Carmine Galante, 1910-9. Even the ground seems hesitant to speak on his behalf, and yet his story doesn't end there. His methods are still studied, his rise still cited, his mistakes whispered as warnings in the back rooms of social clubs and trattorias. Young soldiers are told, don't get greedy, don't forget the commission, and above all, don't let the cigar become more famous than the man. But they still try, because Galante didn't just sell drugs. He sold confidence, a version of power so distilled it didn't need marketing. Just a look, a nod, a silent puff of air through teeth clamped around a dry cigar leaf. And in that confidence, there's a kind of trap. Because if you buy into it too much, you forget the thing Galante never did. Power doesn't protect you. It just makes your downfall more interesting. In the aftermath of Galante's fall, a strange vacuum settles over New York's underworld. Not because there's no one left to run things, but because no one runs them quite like he did. The heroine still moves, of course. Business never sleeps. But the boldness, the autonomy, the sheer audacity that defined Galante's reign, that vanishes with him. It's as though everyone is suddenly reminded of the rules, of the consequences. That cigar in his mouth becomes more than a symbol. It becomes a warning label. Among the zips, things get complicated. These Sicilian imports had been Galante's backbone, his eyes, ears, and fists. With him gone, they're rudderless. Some try to align with new Bonanno leadership. Others return to Sicily. A few go rogue, attempting to recreate what Galante built. But without his precision, without his control, it all becomes sloppy, dangerous. Cesare Bonventre stays quiet, very quiet. He doesn't boast, doesn't gloat. He simply goes back to work, slipping into the Bonanno machinery with the same seamlessness that once made him invisible. Some say he mourns Galante in private. Others claim he's cold, calculating, already reshaping his position for longevity. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in between. Meanwhile, Rastelli, still calling shots from prison, begins to rebuild. His approach is far less flamboyant. He doesn't seek press, doesn't dine in courtyards. He prefers whispers, not headlines. And perhaps that's why the commission tolerates him. He's controllable, predictable, unlike Galante. But here's the irony. Even as Rastelli's star rises, it's Galante's methods that continue shaping the landscape. His distribution models are copied, revised, and quietly rebranded. His compartmentalization tactics become standard practice. The use of imported loyalists, the transatlantic ties, the false bottom shipments, they don't die. They evolve. In this way, Galante lives on, not as a man, but as a playbook. And yet, for all his innovations, his death is a turning point. A loud punctuation in an era that was starting to drift off script. The mob, after Galante, becomes more cautious, less theatrical, a little more corporate, a little less operatic. Gone are the days of bold rooftop luncheons with enemies seated 2 chairs away. Gone are the cigar-chewing dons who dared the world to blink. In their place, quiet meetings in Jersey diners, burner phones, lawyers on retainer. But nostalgia lingers. There's a retired federal agent, now in his 80s, who still keeps a copy of that photo pinned to the corkboard in his garage, not out of triumph, out of respect. He was a bastard, the agent says. But he was our bastard. Pure New York. Knew how to walk slow in a fast city. There's also a shoemaker in Bensonhurst, still in business, who claims he once fitted Galante with custom loafers. He didn't talk much, the old man recalls. But he tipped before I even asked. Left a 10 on the table and said, "Make sure they shine without trying." I still don't know what he meant. The legend isn't just kept alive by old-timers. Younger mob watchers, journalists, crime historians, even rappers invoke Galante's name as shorthand for ruthless cool. He becomes a kind of folklore villain, half real, half cigar smoke. His image, ironically, is cleaner in death than in life. In photographs, he looks composed, unbothered. His eyes seem to ask, "Is this really all you've got?" But beneath that, there's always the deeper truth, the one even admirers must whisper, that Galante's strength was also his flaw. He believed too much in his own myth. He believed he was untouchable, that the rules didn't apply, that loyalty could be imported, and power could be worn like a well-cut suit. And maybe it worked for a while, but the Mafia, despite its shifting structures and whispered protocols, still worships balance. Galante upset the scales, and when scales tip too far, someone always resets them. There's one final anecdote worth telling. Small, quiet, and maybe apocryphal, but it fits. A year after Galante's death, a young associate walks into Joe and Mary's. Not the backyard, the front dining room. He orders espresso and sits by himself. The waitress recognizes him, says nothing, just brings the coffee. He takes one sip, then pulls a cigar from his coat pocket. Doesn't light it, just holds it between his teeth. A beat. Then he sets it down, unfinished, and walks out. He doesn't come back, and no one talks about it, but the staff leaves the cigar on the table until closing, a silent offering to a ghost that somehow still occupies the chair. If Galante was the fire, then the months that followed his assassination were the smoke. Hazy, disorienting, and still lingering in corners no one dared to clean. New York's underworld had experienced many deaths before. Bosses shot in barber chairs, lieutenants garroted in Cadillacs. But this one felt different. Not because it was messier, but because it was precise. A scalpel cut to the heart of a man who thought he was the heart. The families resume business. The commission goes quiet again, like a jury satisfied with its verdict. Rusty Restelli, still behind bars, begins consolidating influence with measured calculation. But while titles shuffle and the machine grinds forward, something intangible has shifted. Fear. Not the kind that comes with a threat in the alleyway or a knock at the door. The quiet kind. The kind that makes soldiers think twice before stepping out of line. The kind that makes mid-level earners lower their voices when saying the name Galante. It's not that he's gone, it's that he was allowed to go. That realization spreads like mold in a damp cellar, slow, creeping, and nearly impossible to scrub clean. Among the Zips, paranoia replaces loyalty. Without Galante, they lack a central figure. Some try to cozy up to new bosses, offering routes, favors, silence. Others keep moving, their accents a liability in a world that no longer values imported allegiance over local obedience. Some vanish, not because anyone kills them, but because they no longer belong. They become ghosts of a failed experiment. Galante's attempt to graft Sicilian fire onto American concrete. Without him, the graft doesn't take. It withers. But his methods? They don't die. In fact, Galante's cold efficiency becomes something of a curriculum. New capos begin copying his financial compartmentalization. They mimic his courier structures. Small, isolated cells that don't communicate across chains. His use of coded language, never discussing heroin directly, always using culinary metaphors, is adopted like a second dialect. Galante's style, too, leaves its mark, not in clothing or cars, but in posture, in presence. A generation of up-and-comers start showing up to meetings with unlit cigars, not because they smoke, but because they understand why he did it. It was a symbol, a smirk in slow motion. A way to say, you think you know what power looks like, but I carry it between my teeth, and like all good symbols, it outlives its source. Meanwhile, law enforcement celebrates. They hold press conferences, unseal indictments, and flash charts showing flowcharts and faces. They call Galante's death the beginning of the end for the Bonanno heroin empire, but the streets laugh. Quietly, of course. Because they know better, the product keeps moving. The routes adapt. Galante's lieutenants either blend into other families or start their own low-profile operations. What changes is not the crime, but the volume. Galante had made noise. The next wave makes money. There's a story from a DEA task force in 1980. An agent cracks a courier chain tied to Montreal. He traces a shipment all the way to a pizza shop in Queens. He arrests the delivery man, young, nervous, chewing his lip. In his report, the agent writes, "When I asked who he worked for, he said, 'I don't know. I just delivered the tomatoes.' I asked if he knew Carmine Galante. He paused, then smiled and said, 'We all do.'" That smile? That's Galante's real legacy. Now, let's zoom out. What made him different? Was it his refusal to play by the rules, or his belief that he was the rules? He wasn't a madman. He wasn't impulsive. In fact, he was alarmingly calm. Even in his most aggressive years, there's little record of emotional outbursts. He didn't scream, didn't threaten theatrically. He whispered. He blinked slowly. He sat still. Stillness in Galante's case was both a weapon and a shield. He mastered the art of unnerving without moving, and that, more than his business sense, more than his reach, more than his Sicilian army, made him dangerous. Because men who don't blink are hard to outmaneuver, and men who die with a cigar in their teeth, they're impossible to forget. Even among his enemies, there's reluctant respect. A Genovese associate, years after Galante's death, reportedly said during a wiretapped conversation, he had too much pride. But he never lied about who he was. That's rare. Another voice, quieter, replied, "He died sitting down. Most don't get that far." But pride, as they say, is a double-edged stiletto. Galante didn't just want power. He wanted sovereignty. He didn't want to rule within the system. He wanted to build his own. And in a world built on quiet consensus, that's a death sentence. So what do you think? Did Galante fly too close to the sun? Or did the sun just get tired of orbiting him? Whatever the answer, the result is the same. One man, one cigar, one afternoon in Bushwick, and a silence that hasn't quite lifted since. By 1981, 2 years after Carmine Galante's blood pooled beneath a grapevine trellis in Bushwick, something strange starts happening. People stop mentioning him out loud. Not because he's forgotten, quite the opposite. It's because his name has become too loaded, too sharp-edged. Like speaking, it invites a shadow into the room. Galante becomes what mobsters quietly refer to as a ghost with keys. He may be dead, but he still opens doors. Doors to fear, to myth, to systems nobody wants to admit still exist. The 5 families, now cautiously restored to equilibrium, don't rush to rewrite Galante's chapter. His seat at the table stays metaphorically empty, like a place left for Elijah at Passover. No one fills it. No one pretends to. The lesson is fresh. Rusty Rastelli, from prison, continues acting as the de facto head of the Bonanno family. But his leadership is more political than personal. He speaks softly, signs off on decisions, keeps the commission happy. He is, in many ways, the anti-Galante. His greatest strength? Not inspiring fear, but inspiring no reaction at all. And that's what the mob wants now. No attention, no photographs, no cigars on patios, just business, done the old way, low, slow, and quiet. But in corners of the city Galante once prowled, his presence still lingers. An old florist in Flatbush keeps a laminated photo of him taped behind the register. When asked why, he shrugs. He paid cash. Always. Another shop owner, this one in Williamsburg, claims to have the last unpaid tab Galante ever left behind. 2 cannoli, 1 espresso, a pack of cigarillos, framed, untouched. Even some law enforcement officers can't help but acknowledge his peculiar afterlife. A DEA agent, long since retired, once said during a conference, Galante didn't just run heroin, he franchised it. Before him it was an import business. After him, it was a supply chain. And in a twisted way, he was right, because Galante's innovations weren't built to last a decade. They were built to survive his absence. The way he broke shipments into smaller, decentralized cells, the way he used immigrants with no U.S. rap sheets, the way he separated handlers from product until the very last handoff. All of it made it harder for the system to collapse with a single arrest. So even though Galante was buried under 6 feet of Cold Queen soil, his system kept breathing. It mutated, like a virus passed between criminal bloodlines. The Zips who stayed behind taught younger soldiers. Retired smugglers whispered his tricks to new couriers. Even rival families began copying his structure. Unspoken acknowledgement of his genius, delivered with reluctant nods over red sauce dinners. But there was always the cautionary whisper too. Don't get too big, don't get too loud, and never ever believe your own legend, because Galante had. And look what happened. Meanwhile, in Sicily, things weren't quiet either. Back home, the Mafia was watching. Some viewed Galante's death as betrayal, New York turning on one of their own. Others shrugged. After all, Galante had stopped answering to anyone, Sicilian or American. He was, in his final days, an emperor without a flag, and emperors historically don't last. Many people still think his death cooled the Sicilian-American relationship for a time. Trust had been severed. The Zips, who had thought New York was theirs to master, learned it wasn't. Not without consequences, but Sicily has a long memory, longer than New York. And they waited. Galante's name faded from headlines, but not from history, and not from nightmares. There's a tale, part fact, part fog, that in a low-lit bar in Palermo, a young Sicilian mobster once toasted to Don Carmine. When an older man raised an eyebrow, the young one explained, "He made Americans respect the soil again." The old man nodded, didn't sip, just nodded. Back in the States, one place where Galante's presence lingers loudest is in prisons. Among the lifers, the young recruits, the men waiting for trial, his story is passed around like a morality play, a lesson, a warning. Galante had the world, they say, and he lost it for lunch. But here's where things get weird. Some still admire him, quietly, not for what he did, but how he did it. He wasn't chaotic. He wasn't flashy. He built his empire not through bloodbaths or headlines, but through consistency, loyalty, and precision. A different world might have turned him into a CEO. Instead, he chose, or perhaps was born into, a world of shadows and vines. There's a letter, unearthed years later, allegedly written by Galante while in prison in the 1960s. It was never mailed, just found tucked inside a worn paperback of The Prince by Machiavelli. The letter reads in part, "I do not fear death. I fear being forgotten. Men who are useful are remembered. Men who are feared are studied. I intend to be both." No signature, just a date, 1963. And he was right, because here we are, still remembering, still studying, still staring at that photograph and asking how. How does a man sit in the sun, knowing full well he's a target? How does he chew calmly, drink slowly, and smile with a cigar in his mouth as the world closes in? And how does the cigar stay in place? It wasn't glued. It wasn't faked. It was will. It was Galante. In the years following Galante's death, the streets he once dominated don't exactly forget him. They adapt to his absence. His ghost lingers not as a specter of vengeance, but as a caution sign flickering behind every backroom deal. The men who come up after him know his name, but more importantly, they know what not to do with it. By the mid-1980s, the Mafia is in the midst of a slow, methodical implosion. Not because of Galante directly, but because the world he thrived in is beginning to fray at the seams. Wiretaps get sharper, surveillance gets quieter. RICO becomes the alphabet soup that every capo fears, and snitches Those rare birds once considered mythical start flying in flocks. Still, in certain pockets of New York, places where butcher paper still wraps envelopes and espresso machines hiss with old gossip, you hear Galante's name in tones reserved for dead kings. Reverent, wary, his shadow falls long. One major change post-Galante is how families view foreign muscle. The era of importing Sicilian zips in large numbers slowly cools. Galante's over-reliance on outsiders, while initially effective, becomes a case study in what happens when loyalty lacks roots. His men were obedient, yes, but to him, not to the institution. And when he was gone, so was their purpose. The Commission learns from this. Future bosses focus on homegrown loyalty, nephews over foreigners, neighborhood guys over transplants. The idea is simple. Build an army that bleeds the same streets you do. But no one replicates Galante's grip on heroin. No one dares to. That territory becomes chopped up, sold off in slices, and rebranded. The Corsican labs? Some close. Others shift operations to more discreet locales. The Sicilian pipeline? Still functional, but slower, thinner. The pipeline doesn't die. It just forgets Galante's name. Out loud. Yet the ghosts show up in numbers. There's a DEA report from 1986, long buried in an archive until rediscovered decades later, that outlines a heroin bust in Newark. The product is traced back through 4 layers of distributors. At the end of the chain, a name appears on a customs form. A minor player, mostly unknown. But scribbled in the margin, almost as an afterthought, is a note. This network was built on old Galante roots, still intact. Think about that. 7 years dead, still intact. That's not a pipeline. That's a monument. Meanwhile, Galante's family, his real one, not the family, mostly keeps their heads down. Some leave the city. Others change names, marry quietly, or dive into legitimate businesses. But they carry the weight. The same last name that once opened doors now draws raised eyebrows. Some wear it with pride. Others tuck it in their wallets like an ID from a different life. And what about Bonventre? Cesare Bonventre. The loyal shadow who stood beside Galante the moment the trigger was pulled, and then somehow stepped away untouched. He doesn't last long. In 1984, Bonventre's body is found dismembered and stuffed into glue drums inside a Brooklyn warehouse. Officially, the murder is chalked up to internal Bonanno politics. He had grown too ambitious, or too suspicious, or maybe he simply reminded people of Galante at the wrong moment. Many people still think Bonventre knew too much about Galante, about the men who sanctioned him, about how things really played out that July afternoon. So what do you think? Was Bonventre eliminated as a threat, or silenced as a loose end? Either way, it's poetic. The last living thread to Galante's inner circle is severed inside a barrel, packed tight, like a shipment meant never to arrive. And yet, even that doesn't erase Galante, because you can't kill what was never entirely alive. Galante wasn't a man, not by the time he died. He was a structure, a set of systems, an attitude, a code. You see it in how modern criminals mimic him, even if they don't know they're doing it. The lean-back stare, the refusal to blink first, the half-smile that says, "You don't know what I know." They're echoes. Galante's story starts showing up in unusual places. College criminology courses dissect his operation. True crime podcasts romanticize his final moments. He becomes the center of Mafia documentaries, usually somewhere between Gotti's flash and Castellano's caution. But here's the thing. He doesn't fit in. He wasn't a showman like Gotti. He wasn't calculated like Gambino. He was pure intent. No frills. Just efficiency and conviction. Even the FBI agents who spent years tailing him speak of him differently. He was quiet, one of them said. But you never forgot when he walked in. He didn't need volume. The cigar said enough. There's a mural on a warehouse wall in Bushwick now. Small, discreet, fading. It doesn't say Galante's name. Just a black silhouette of a man seated at a table, cigar in mouth, head turned just slightly. Some say it was painted by a local artist who grew up hearing stories. Others say it appeared overnight, but everyone agrees it feels like him. That stillness, that stare, that moment before everything changes. So, here we are, decades later, and the question still hangs in the air like smoke under a low ceiling. Was Galante the last of the true believers, or the first of the unstoppable egos? Either way, his story remains, half warning, half blueprint, and entirely unforgettable. Time, as it always does, tries to dull the edges. It softens the colors in the photographs, blurs the ink in the case files, makes ghosts seem less urgent. But with Carmine Galante, memory resists erosion. There's something about the way he left the world. Cigar intact, shirt rumpled, eyes fixed on nothing, that sears itself into collective memory. It wasn't just the brutality, it was the posture, the stillness. You could almost believe he'd just finished lunch and was about to ask for espresso. In the 1990s, the Mafia undergoes a metamorphosis. Old faces disappear, some to prison, others to witness protection, a few to graves with names changed or omitted entirely. The commission loses its grip. Informants rise. Wiretaps replace whispers. Lawyers outnumber lieutenants. But underneath the headlines, the day-to-day operations survive in fragments. And in those fragments, Galante's fingerprints are still visible. A heroin bust in Staten Island reveals shipment patterns identical to those Galante pioneered in the 70s. A surveillance log from Toronto notes the names of two middle-aged Sicilian men, neither with criminal records, using a method Galante designed. Dual-drop parcels in bakery vans. Never the same driver twice. He may be gone, but he's not gone. Young mobsters, if such a thing can still exist in a world with fewer codes and more courtroom recordings, don't always know the full story. They've heard the name, maybe seen the photo, but they don't understand the design. They mimic the myth without studying the architecture, and yet every once in a while, one of them gets it. A kid out of Bensonhurst, trying to make his bones, reportedly once told his mentor, "I don't want to be Gotti. I want to be Galante." The older man blinked. "You want to end up in a lawn chair with your face gone?" The kid shrugged. "Depends what happens before the chair, and that's the point." Galante didn't build his legacy on longevity. He built it on clarity. He knew who he was. He knew what he wanted. He didn't flinch when the system frowned. He just leaned further into it. There's a photo, not as famous as the photo, but maybe more revealing. It shows Galante outside a cafe in 1976. He's mid-stride, coat open, mouth slightly parted as if speaking. His hand is half raised, pointing. The man walking next to him, a bodyguard or a driver, no one knows, looks nervous. Galante doesn't. If you look closely, you can almost read the words forming on his lips. This way, always this way, never back. Even historians, usually allergic to glorifying crime figures, admit that Galante's career is uniquely instructive. He didn't rise through flamboyance. He wasn't born into a dynasty. He built his empire from silence, from systems, from staring a hole through whoever stood in his path. There's a phrase that pops up in old FBI briefings, Galante syndrome. It refers to mid-level guys who get too ambitious too fast, who start bypassing protocol, building personal armies, ignoring the chain of command. Every time it ends the same. Lunch, blood, silence. You'd think they'd learn, but ambition, like heroin, is addictive. And speaking of heroin, Even as the Mafia's grip loosens on traditional rackets, narcotics remain oddly persistent. Other players step in: Colombians, Dominicans, Albanians. But Galante's business blueprint continues to influence the flow. Sicilian suppliers still prefer the routes he once favored. Older distributors still reference Carmine's method when explaining packaging logistics. And DEA agents still cite his playbook when training new recruits. One of them, during a Q&A at Quantico, was asked what made Galante different from the other heroin dons of his era. The agent smiled. He treated crime like engineering. He didn't improvise, he calculated. Then, after a pause, added, "And he never smoked the cigar." The detail again matters, because in a world where image often trumps substance, Galante flipped the equation. The unlit cigar became more iconic than any explosion, any trial, any betrayal. It was a badge of restraint in a business addicted to excess. He didn't need fireworks, just silence, structure, and stare-downs. Let's rewind for a moment to the day before his death. He reportedly spent it doing nothing extraordinary. A short walk, a quiet meal, some phone calls, a haircut. The barber who trimmed his sideburns that day remembered Galante tipping well, smiling faintly, and saying, "You ever notice how people look most honest right before they lie?" The barber didn't answer, just nodded. Later, he'd say it was the only time he felt Galante was talking about himself. The following afternoon, Galante died, and whether you see it as hubris, inevitability, or just bad timing, one thing is certain: he died without blinking, which raises the question again: was it worth it? Did the empire he built, the loyalty he cultivated, the enemies he accrued, did it justify the fall? So what do you think? Does the legacy outlast the man? Or is the man swallowed by the myth? Maybe it doesn't matter, because in the end, Carmine Galante achieved what most bosses only dream of. He controlled the table until the final bite. As the years stretch on, Carmine Galante's legend settles into that strange layer of cultural memory, where fact and folklore blend until even those who lived through it aren't sure what was real. But here's what remains indisputable. Galante left an imprint, not just in the history of organized crime, but in the psychology of it. The blueprint he drew, of silence, precision, and unblinking control, became a kind of dark gospel. You see it in how stories are told decades later, not with bravado, but with reverence. Not for what Galante did, but how he did it. The quiet lunches, the undisturbed suit, the cigar that became a crown, and perhaps most telling, the way men still lower their voices when they say his name, even when there's no one left alive to be afraid of. There's an old man in a senior center in Staten Island, once an errand boy for the Bonannos, now just a guy with a TV tray and a crossword book. Every Thursday, he plays dominoes with 3 other retirees who've all been around. No one says how, but once a year, on the week of July 12th, he brings cannoli. 4 of them. 1 for each of the living, and 1 left untouched. When asked about it, he just smiles and says, "That one's for the Don. He never got dessert." These small gestures, half tribute and half superstition, keep the ember alive. Not the man, he's long gone, but the idea of him. The one who didn't flinch, the one who didn't ask, the one who never lit the fuse, because the threat of fire was enough. And yet there's an unease in how that legacy lives, because Galante didn't just challenge the Mafia's structure. He challenged its balance. He believed so fully in his own force of will that he ignored the truth behind every successful mobster. Survival depends on negotiation, not domination. It's the thing his successors understood, had to understand, to avoid his fate. Which brings us to the quiet part, not the part in the newspapers, not the FBI files or the mugshots, but the wind down, the fade out, the after. There's something about Galante's story that resists finality. Even in death, he refuses to vanish neatly. His absence doesn't feel complete. It feels paused, like a record still spinning with no sound. A meal half-eaten. A chair pushed back, but not tucked in. That's the unease people talk about when they mention him. The sense that something was left, unfinished. Maybe that's why his story lingers longer than others. Not because it ended dramatically, but because it ended mid-thought. And when things end mid-thought, we replay them. We wonder what would have happened if he hadn't gone to lunch that day. If the Zips hadn't stepped aside. If the commission had blinked first. We wonder if maybe, just maybe, he knew it was coming and didn't care. Some people live for power. Galante? He lived as power. And power, when it dies, doesn't just disappear. It echoes, softly now, a murmur in the background, like a fan spinning overhead, like the distant hush of city traffic through a cracked window, like the end of a story that doesn't say goodbye, but simply slows down. So now, wherever you are, wherever you're listening from, take a breath, let the noise drift, let the room settle, and think of a man in a short-sleeved shirt, sitting in the sun, a half smile on his face, and a cigar, still unlit, resting gently between his teeth. He's not speaking. He doesn't have to. The silence is doing just fine. The years continue to pile up like fallen leaves on the sidewalk. Quiet, consistent, mostly unnoticed until you stop and look down. By the early 2000s, Galante's physical presence is long gone. His name more a whisper among older wise guys than a line in the daily reports. But every now and then, he resurfaces, not in flesh, but in method, in blueprint, in caution. There's a case in Philadelphia, small-time heroin ring, nothing headline-worthy. But a veteran detective reviewing the setup pauses mid-page and mutters, "This is Galante-style work." The younger agents raise their eyebrows. Galante? Wasn't he killed in the 70s? He was, but his systems, still moving. It's like discovering a vintage watch still ticking decades after the craftsman has vanished. You don't ask why it works. You just marvel that it still does. And here's the thing. Galante wasn't just running a business. He was creating an architecture. The scaffolding of independent power. The flow of product without fingerprints. The layering of loyalty over silence, stitched through with just enough fear to keep the whole thing airtight. After his death, the Bonanno family never fully reclaims that scope of control. Sure, they survive, reorganize, name new bosses, push through the decades with varying degrees of visibility and disgrace. But the engine that Galante built, that's gone. He hadn't just orchestrated heroin distribution, he was the system. When the driver becomes the drive, removing him leaves only confusion in the seat. And yet, those who replaced him never talk about dismantling what he created. They talk around it, avoid his name in sit-downs, change the terminology. It's not Galante's roots, it's the old channels, as if saying his name invokes something, some form of unspoken debt. Even among his enemies, there's a kind of reluctant awe, a respect not for what he did, but for how decisively he did it. The absence of hesitation, the ability to occupy a room with nothing but a chair, a stare, and an unlit cigar. That's the kind of power that doesn't expire. It just waits, and sometimes it finds strange ways to reappear. There's a restaurant in Brooklyn, not far from where Galante died. Changed hands a dozen times since. New name, new tiles, new owners. But one thing remains. A back table in the patio corner no one ever seems to sit at. Not because it's cursed, not because anyone's afraid. It's just understood. One waiter, pressed by a curious journalist, finally relents. He leans in, lowers his voice, and says, "That table already has a story. We're just keeping the ending intact." The journalist, of course, writes it up. includes the now iconic image in the piece. The photo of Galante in repose, mid-meal, mid-sentence, mid-myth, and again the story ripples outward. People Google him, read the timeline, ask why someone so powerful ended up so exposed. But power, as Galante knew, isn't about hiding. It's about owning the table, even when the guns are coming. Back in Sicily, older men still reference him, not always kindly, but always clearly. He's remembered as a man who tried to reshape the game, who fused the old country ruthlessness with new world logistics, who built his own Vatican inside a crumbling church. But in New York, he's remembered differently, not as a visionary, not even as a rebel, but as inevitable, like rain on a wedding day, like rust on a blade, something you can't avoid, only manage. And when they speak of him, those who still do, they don't say he was right. They say he was real, and that might be the most dangerous thing a gangster can be, because real men leave real consequences, not just bodies, but blueprints. There's a small-time dealer in Jersey who once said, "You can always tell who read the Galante book. They talk low, move slow, and don't repeat themselves." He wasn't wrong. Even now, Galante's ghost rides in the back seat of black sedans, watches over briefcases in Newark motels, hangs behind the register at Italian restaurants where the pasta's too expensive and the espresso never comes with a bill, because the story isn't done being told, and maybe it never will be. By the time the 2010s roll in with smartphones and surveillance drones, the Mafia, at least as it was once understood, is fading into the rearview mirror of American crime. No more lavish clubhouses. No more rows of Cadillacs lining Brooklyn streets outside christenings or funerals. The suits are cheaper, the crimes more fragmented, the loyalty thinner. But Galante, he somehow grows larger, not in presence, not in active memory, but in myth. The way people talk about him becomes different, less about the man and more about the silhouette he left behind. One narcotics detective, long retired and now lecturing at a city college, puts it like this: Galante didn't just run heroin. He was heroin. The purity, the danger, the high, the crash, all in one man. His students chuckle, unsure if it's hyperbole or history, but he isn't joking. Because in the annals of organized crime, most figures either burn fast or fade slow. Galante did neither. He etched himself in, not through charm or chaos, but through cold control. Even in an era of digital footprints and offshore servers, his systems hold up. In 2012, federal prosecutors dismantle a heroin operation based in Detroit with roots in Montreal. One of the younger smugglers, when pressed during interrogation, admits the operation's protocols were modeled after something an uncle used to run under a guy named Carmine. The agents blink, 33 years dead, and Galante's still offering structure. The blueprint holds. Meanwhile, in pop culture, Galante remains a shadow figure. He doesn't get the flash of Gotti or the cinematic flair of Capone. He's not the star of any HBO dramatization, but he shows up in the way mob bosses are portrayed: reserved, unreadable, iron in their jaw, in the trope of the cigar that says more than dialogue ever could. He's the character with no dialogue in the first act who ends the second with a stare. And then there's the academic world. Mafia historians, once focused on the flashy decline of the five families, begin to re-examine the quiet architects, the ones who weren't caught on tape bragging, the ones who rarely spoke English in public, the ones who looked more like bankers than butchers. Galante moves from footnote to focal point, not because he was the most violent, but because he was the most prepared, and because he had something the others lacked: a system that didn't need him to function, which in organized crime is rare. Most bosses are gravity wells. Everything revolves around them. When they're gone, it collapses. Galante? He built a machine that ran without a driver. That's not ego, that's engineering. Still, his story doesn't inspire many copycats. Why? because his path ended the way all ambitious blueprints do, in a garden with bullets and a half-eaten meal. Even the most devoted student of Galante's system eventually reaches the same reality. Power comes with a price, and the higher you sit, the less warning you get before the table's pulled. So instead, his story becomes a lesson. Taught in code, shared between sips of espresso, recounted in the backs of restaurants by men whose fathers once knew a guy who ran with him. It's not pride, it's proximity, because being close to Galante, that meant something. It meant you were part of the system that almost beat the old one. Almost. And then there are the rumors. Of course there are. No great gangster story lives without them. Some say the cigar found in his mouth wasn't the one he had before lunch. It was replaced after, a symbol by the shooters themselves. Others claim he knew it was his last meal, that he showed up to that table resigned. Or worse, content. Theories swirl like smoke rings, but the truth, it's probably simpler. Galante lived the way he died, seated at the table, sure of his place, sure that even if he were wrong, the system would remember him. And it did. It still does. There's a small Catholic chapel in Queens where someone, no one knows who, leaves a single unlit cigar on the steps every July 12th. No note, no fanfare, just the offering, an unburned tribute to a man who lit no fuses, started no fires, but made the world think he might at any moment. So what do you think? Is the man still teaching us something? Or are we just slow to forget the smell of power? Either way, the chair he left behind is still empty, and the smoke, still curling. The Mafia that stumbles into the 2020s is a ghost of its former self. The social clubs are shuttered. The streets no longer hum with code words and nods passed between butcher and bookmaker. Surveillance is everywhere. Rats have grown more common than earners. Even the word omerta feels like a relic, spoken more in documentaries than dining rooms. But in the places where the old names are still whispered, where loyalty, however brittle, still means something, Galante remains a fixed star. You don't see him anymore. Not even in the new crime books flooding Amazon or the miniseries desperate for another mob anti-hero to glamorize. He wasn't photogenic enough, not charming enough, not quotable. But that's the thing. He didn't want to be. Galante wasn't a Gotti, chasing headlines and nightclub flashbulbs. He was the undercurrent, the system running quietly under your feet while you danced. And those who study crime at the structural level, they still point to him. Criminologists, mob scholars, even cybersecurity analysts dissect his network the way some people study classic architecture. Awed not by the beauty, but by the sheer durability. They use words like modular, decentralized, resilient. 3 terms Galante probably never heard, but he lived them. And that cigar, God help us, that cigar still shows up. On t-shirts sold by vendors in Little Italy. On posters in college dorm rooms next to quotes he never said. On tattoos inked into the biceps of men who never heard his voice. It becomes something beyond a weapon or warning. It becomes the idea of control, a symbol that doesn't shout, a legacy that doesn't need fire to leave a burn. In one obscure podcast about mafia psychology, a guest, a former mob lawyer turned professor, puts it perfectly. Galante wasn't famous because he was loud. He was famous because he was inevitable. If you build a system well enough, the world remembers it, whether it ends with a chair and a bullet or not. Still, the modern world doesn't leave much room for inevitability. Galante's empire, had it survived intact, would be facing border patrol algorithms, bank audits, data leaks, encrypted messaging, and rivals more likely to code than to carry guns. But that doesn't mean his story is irrelevant. It means it's become foundation. His model of compartmentalized logistics, it shows up in cartel structures. His tactic of layering loyalty and fear in equal doses, it appears in corporate espionage cells. His refusal to let the product pass through the same hands twice, that's now standard protocol for criminal syndicates in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. They may not know they're using Galante's methods, but they are, because efficiency has no expiration date. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, in a 2023 trial in Brooklyn, where a mid-level drug trafficker is asked on the stand how he designed his network. He pauses, then says, "We didn't reinvent the wheel, we just cleaned the spokes." Later, in prison, he reportedly tells a visitor, "It's still Carmine's playbook, just with better phones." Somewhere, that would have made Galante smile. Not laugh, he wasn't the laughing type, just that small lift of the mouth. The one that says, "Of course." And here's the strange part. Despite all the books, the stories, the retrospectives, there's still more we don't know about him than what we do. He left no memoirs, no famous quotes, no sidekick with a podcast deal, just shadows, just structures, just silence. And maybe that's the legacy he wanted, because loud men get noticed, quiet men get remembered. And Galante? He engineered the long game. There's a new generation now, digital natives, plugged-in dreamers, amateur historians, with no first-hand memory of the Mafia's heyday. But some of them still find his story, still study that photo, still look into those eyes and wonder, what kind of man dies like that? Answer, a man who already knew. A man who decided that legacy was worth the target. A man who believed that silence, well wielded, could echo louder than gunshots. So what do you think? Was he right? Or was he just early? Whatever the answer, the record keeps spinning. And somewhere, in a drawer, behind an old espresso machine in a Brooklyn bakery that survived 6 name changes and 2 renovations, a waitress opens the till and finds a cigar. Unlit, slightly cracked, still dry. No one knows how long it's been there, but no one moves it, just in case. In every empire, whether forged by sword or silence, there comes a moment where myth overtakes memory. With Carmine Galante, that line was crossed the moment his blood dried on the patio tiles. From then on, he became more idea than man. Hard to define, harder to shake off, and perhaps that was his final play, because while others chased notoriety in bright lights, Galante did the opposite. He wrapped his ambition in plain clothes, dined modestly, spoke sparingly, avoided flash not because he feared it, but because it was inefficient. Everything about him was calibrated. Even his death, in its cold finality, felt more like punctuation than tragedy. The modern mob, or what's left of it, remembers him not in eulogies or plaques, but in practice. There's a retired capo who still runs a quiet catering business on Long Island. On the second floor, behind a locked door and a mop bucket, is a room no one uses anymore. On the wall hangs a single black and white photo, Galante in a 3-piece suit, looking off-frame, arms crossed. No cigar this time. Just eyes that seem to know more than they should. "Why keep it there?" a nephew once asked. The old man answered, "Because that face kept a lot of people alive, and a few very dead." It's a sentiment echoed elsewhere in different words by men who now wear reading glasses instead of wiretaps. Galante's image is no longer feared, but it is respected. And in this world, that means more. Take the international front. In Palermo, Marseille, Montreal, his name carries an odd weight. He's not mentioned in the current logistics or family trees, but his approach still shows up. In France, an investigative report from 2021 on a Corsican trafficking ring uncovered ledgers handwritten in an old shorthand, abbreviations, misdirection, substitutions. When the files were decoded, the pattern was eerily similar to the way Galante's operatives structured their movement in the 70s. Was it coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe his system, once so effective, had simply become the system. And that's the thing about systems. They outlive kings. Even the FBI, long done chasing old-school dons, continues to teach Galante's methodology in select training programs. A diagram of his heroin network, Montreal to New York, via zips and zippers, is still pinned to classroom walls at Quantico as a case study in decentralized trafficking. One instructor calls him the ghost in the flowchart, which is exactly the kind of phrase Galante would have loved, because he didn't crave applause. He craved control. He didn't demand loyalty. He built it, layer by layer, node by node, and when it broke, it didn't scream. It simply collapsed like scaffolding pulled at the right angle. There's a lesser-known detail from the aftermath of his death, an evidence log never made public, found in the crawl space above a deli connected to one of his old safe houses. Inside, a cigar box containing not cigars, but numbers. Just numbers. Dates, weights, names reduced to initials. No clear keys, no context. To this day, no one's cracked it, because Galante didn't just play chess. He played time. He wasn't planning for tomorrow. He was laying groundwork for a decade later, perhaps even for players he'd never meet. One of his former drivers, now long retired and legally blind, gave an interview for an unpublished memoir in 2015. He described a night in 1978, just a year before Galante's death. We were parked outside a florist in Queens. Cold night. He's just sitting there, not talking. Then he turns and says, "One day someone will say my name and not even know why they're afraid." The driver laughed at the time. "I thought it was dramatic nonsense. But now," he said, staring past the recorder, "now I think maybe I didn't understand the man at all." That's the enduring mystery. Galante was never flamboyant, never theatrical. Yet he haunts the underworld more deeply than men who stage their lives like operas. Why? Because silence sticks. Because confidence without ego is rare. Because even in death, he left the room cleaner than he found it. So what do you think? Was he a relic of the old world or the prototype for the new? Was his end a lesson in limits or a blueprint for how far one man can go before the curtain drops? One thing is clear. Even if the seats have changed, the table he built is still standing, and that chair, still empty. By the third decade of the 21st century, most gangsters from the golden era of the American mob have either passed away, faded into obscurity, or had their stories commodified into streaming docuseries with dramatic lighting and stock jazz music. But Carmine Galante? He remains largely untouched by Hollywood's hand, and that, somehow, makes his story feel purer. You won't find him as the main character in a Netflix miniseries. He's too cold, too clean, too real. Galante doesn't make for good television, not in the modern sense. He doesn't monologue, doesn't confess, doesn't blink. He just acts. And yet, despite this absence from pop culture's spotlight, his name still circulates in the most unexpected places. Take a cybersecurity conference in Milan. A speaker discussing decentralized threat networks uses the term Galante configuration to describe the layered independence of cells within a trafficking structure. The term gets picked up, shared, tweeted. It spreads, not because of the man, but because of the efficiency he represented. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, the last few vestiges of his physical world continue their quiet crumble. The courtyard where he died is gone now, renovated into high-end apartments with sliding doors and herb gardens. There's no plaque, no marker, just a long shadow cast by gentrification. But if you know the address, you can still stand on the sidewalk where the gate once was. And if you stand there long enough, a man in his 60s, maybe a doorman, maybe a former something else, might walk by and say, "You looking for history or ghosts? Either way, you're in the right place." The evolution of crime has left behind men like Galante. Today's empires are built in server rooms, not salumerias. Routes are mapped through IP addresses, not shipping ledgers. Loyalty is encrypted, not sworn. And still Galante's systems keep appearing, in how modern smuggling operations use clean middlemen who never meet their handlers, in how digital laundering schemes separate stages by 4 degrees of deniability, in how anonymity has become the product as much as the contraband. In this way, Galante becomes a patron saint of the unseen. He wouldn't understand the language of VPNs or blockchain wallets, but he'd understand the instincts behind them, because he knew that the less you say, the less they can take from you. There's a graduate thesis written at Columbia in 2025 that analyzes the psychological profiles of Mafia leaders from 1920 to 1990. The author dedicates an entire chapter to Galante, not as a man, but as a theory. He writes, Galante is unique in that he defied the emotional arc we expect from powerful men. There is no rise and fall narrative, no confessional, no redemption. He simply operated like a humming machine in a locked room. And when it broke, no one tried to fix it. They just shut the door. That door, still closed and still humming. So what happens now in the wake of everything? With the heroin routes changed, the names forgotten, the clubs bulldozed. What happens to a legacy when there's no one left to claim it? It settles into the bricks of back alley restaurants where no one sits at the corner table, into the hands of young couriers using burner phones without knowing who invented the system they're mimicking, into the silence. That's where Galante lives now. Not in headlines, but in blueprints. Not in eulogies, but in systems. And occasionally, in dreams. Ask the old men. They'll tell you they still see him sometimes, sitting across from them in half-forgotten cafes, not saying a word, just tapping ash that never falls, wearing that same short-sleeved shirt, that same smirk that says you'll never really know what I know. And when they wake up, they check their pockets, they check the locks, they whisper, he's still working, isn't he? Maybe he is. So what do you think? Does legacy fade when the man dies? Or does it only become dangerous once he's no longer around to shape it? One thing's for sure, the chair is still there, the espresso's still warm, and the cigar still unlit. In quiet corners of Brooklyn, stories about Carmine Galante still travel like wind in alleyways. Low, indirect, and surprisingly persistent. You won't hear them from people with TikTok accounts or podcast microphones. You'll hear them from the kinds of men who still roll their own sleeves, who still stir espresso with the handle of their spoon. Men who sit near windows and never put their backs to the door. He had a thing with time, one of them might say. Eyes on his watch, even if it's not ticking, and he did. Galante didn't just use time, he weaponized it. His power was never about scale or muscle. It was about waiting, watching, letting others declare their positions first, then folding his cards slowly while the table leaned forward, already too late. That's why his system worked, and why it still echoes. Take the international black market today. A Europol report in 2027 references a Balkan trafficking route that mirrors Galante's transatlantic model almost precisely. When asked how such a dated method could persist, the analyst smiles. Because it works. He wasn't building for 1979. He was building for whenever. In Sicily, younger foot soldiers still refer to tight, no-contact drop structures as Galante grids, even if they don't know who he was. The name has become shorthand for frictionless logistics. That's not history. That's immortality through design. But here's the trick Galante understood, better than any of his peers. Power is not just held, it's sensed. He rarely raised his voice, but his silence arrived like smoke under a closed door, noticeable before it was acknowledged. His presence made men sit straighter. His absence made them nervous. And that's not bravado, that's calibration. A man once said of him, he knew exactly when to sip, when to chew, and when to leave the check unsigned. Now imagine trying to teach that. You can't. You either are that, or you follow the man who was. which is what so many still do. His systems get stripped for parts. His mannerisms get mimicked. Poorly, usually. His name? It shows up in dossiers, in whispers, in the margins of ledgers where initials mean more than full names. And always, there's the cigar. The most famous one, of course. Stayed clenched between his teeth as bullets found him. But there were dozens before that. He chewed them down like deadlines. He held them like punctuation. Not a habit, but a gesture. There's a black and white photograph, rarely circulated, taken months before his death. Galante's in a back room, seated in a plain wooden chair. Nothing grand, no throne, no velvet curtain. But the way he sits, you'd think the room was his courtroom. Two men beside him are mid-conversation, animated, maybe even nervous. Galante isn't speaking. He's not even looking at them. He's watching the door. That's what the photo shows. Not paranoia, awareness. That was his advantage. Where others saw turf, he saw angles. Where others played short games, he played continuity. He wasn't after a headline. He was building an architecture, and the foundation, still holding. So what becomes of a man like that? Not in death, we know how that ended, but in the decades after, as history tries to process him, he becomes the part of the story that never quite resolves. The ellipsis at the end of the paragraph. The shadow behind the curtain long after the lights come up. He's not remembered with affection, or even nostalgia. He's remembered with precision, and maybe that's what he wanted. No legend, no sainthood, just clarity. In a world of liars and survivors, Galante was the rare figure who didn't bluff. He didn't threaten. He just was. So what do you think? Was that his greatest trick? To convince the world he was inevitable? And then build systems so sturdy they made him so? Or was he just the last man in the room willing to act like the room belonged to him? Either way, somewhere, maybe in the back office of a small coffee shop still run by cousins of cousins, there's a dusty drawer. And inside it, a list, written in ink. No dates, no context, just names. And one near the bottom, circled. Galante, still keeping company, still watching the door. Even in death, Galante keeps showing up where no one expects him. On shipping manifests, in conversations in prison yards, between the lines of declassified case files. He's not there, of course, not physically, but his signature is, and it's always the same. Clean structure, minimal noise, maximum effect, a pattern, a rhythm, a silence that moves. That's what truly terrifies people who study him. Not the violence he unleashed, but the ease with which he made it work. The fact that so many people were loyal to a man who offered no charisma, no flattery, no fake warmth. He gave them nothing but the confidence of absolute control, and they followed, because control is magnetic. Today, in the digital underworld, yes, that exists too, there are traffickers who never set foot in New York but still use a code they call G-boxes for Galante's original relay method. One location, one pickup, no contact, no trace. This isn't homage. This is utility. He created a method that doesn't care who uses it. In a way, he democratized underworld logistics. Think about that. There's even a theory among some modern crime analysts that Galante's greatest innovation wasn't heroin. It was efficiency under pressure. He took a volatile industry and gave it temperature control. He didn't just move drugs, he moved trust, from hand to hand, city to city, without a single unnecessary word. That doesn't die when a man dies. That embeds itself in infrastructure. Meanwhile, in academia, the myth continues to reshape itself. One criminology professor at NYU ends every semester with a Galante case study. Not as a morality tale, but as a systems analysis. The final slide of the lecture, a still shot of Galante on the patio, cigar, eyes open, chair slightly angled, and under it, 3 words, systems remember engineers. It's not just catchy, it's true, because even when his crew scattered, when his zips fled or fell, when the routes adjusted and the names changed. What he built didn't collapse, it recalibrated. What happened on July 12, 1979, was not the erasure of an empire. It was the removal of a pilot from a ship that knew where it was going anyway. Ask any veteran federal agent from the era. They'll tell you the same thing. Galante didn't make heroin kingpins. He made templates, and everyone else just printed their names on top. In one of the few surviving first-hand DEA memos that mentioned him posthumously, an analyst wrote, "Galante may be dead, but we're still running his route map through customs logs." The ink faded, not the road. What more can you say? There's a bar in Montreal, old, wood-paneled, never renovated, where every July someone reserves a booth in the back. No name, no tip, just $100 bill and a request. Espresso, and don't clear the extra glass. The waitress, who's been working there 30 years, knows the drill. One espresso, one empty glass, every year. No one drinks it, but everyone knows who it's for. They say ghosts don't drink, but sometimes ghosts return. Through systems, through rituals, through names scribbled in ledgers too old to throw away. So what do you think? Is Carmine Galante still alive in these rituals? In these roots? In these quiet, stubborn pockets of unspoken fear? Or is this just what happens when the echo of certainty refuses to fade? When a man builds not to last, but to outlast. Either way, one thing's for sure. His seat remains untouched. And the smoke still hasn't cleared. In the ever-shifting sands of organized crime, time erodes most legacies, like salt water on brick. But Galante's? His legacy doesn't crumble. It calcifies. And that's because he didn't build his empire atop personalities or presence. He built it on process. In crime, that's rare. Most mobsters are mythologized through chaos. Gunfights, courtroom outbursts, flamboyant farewells. They write their names in smoke. But Galante? He etched his in ledgers, quietly, permanently, and long after his murder, those ledgers still whisper his name. One retired U.S. Customs officer, giving a talk at a security symposium in Miami, tells a room full of border agents, the strangest thing about Galante, you can still feel him in the paperwork. The shell companies, the ghost routes, the unclaimed cargo. It's like finding fingerprints that no longer belong to fingers. And that's just it. His influence isn't theatrical, it's structural. Consider the Dominican corridor in the 2020s. A smuggling path from Puerto Plata to Newark that somehow, without digital coordination, maintains tight, consistent protocol. Separate handlers, no reuse of drop sites, zero verbal confirmation. Federal investigators mapping it in 2028 pause when the pattern emerges. One of them, a junior analyst, finally blurts out, "Wait, isn't this just Galante but with better phones?" Exactly. His method is now default, not because of legacy, but because it works. And that's where the real chill lives. Not in the violence of his end, but in the endurance of his model. Galante created a system so fundamentally sound that even time can't unbolt it. No documentaries needed, no glamour, just pure, unyielding function. A journalist once wrote of him, "Galante didn't just sell drugs, he sold certainty in an uncertain world." That's the scariest product of all. And even now, in the boardrooms of cartels and the encrypted channels of modern traffickers, that certainty is the goal. Not power, not territory, but predictability. The kind Galante baked into every tier of his operation like a contractor pouring steel into concrete. So when people say, "The Mafia is dead," they're only half right. The name may have changed. The faces may be younger, hungrier, less reverent, but the rules, still his. And every so often, the past refuses to stay in the background. There's a moment, almost comedic, in a federal trial against a Colombian middleman in 2029. He's being asked to name his operation structure. He replies, confused, "It's just how the New Yorkers always did it." When pressed, "What New Yorkers?" He shrugs. "The ones with the cigars. I don't know their names." Of course he doesn't. but we do. And maybe that's the most Galante thing of all, to leave a fingerprint so deeply pressed into the machinery that no one remembers who made it. They just keep using the machine. So what do you think? Was he just a man with a plan, or a plan that used a man? There's a theory, quietly shared among older wise guys, that Galante never really died. That part of him still lives in every silent nod, every untraced shipment, every locked drawer that opens with a knowing sigh. It's not ghost story stuff. It's something colder, something realer. Because if systems are memory, and memory shapes behavior, then Galante is still here, everywhere, unseen, unsmiling, unmoving. And as long as someone still whispers, "Keep it clean like Carmine," the shadow remains. In warehouses, in customs reports, in the small gap of silence between a question asked and a glance exchanged. Still him, still working, as decades stretch out like a quiet road at dusk. The men who once feared Carmine Galante begin to die off, not in bloody hits or courtroom collapses, but in recliners, in hospice beds, in the soft flicker of forgotten memory. And yet, his name stays behind, not in mourning, but in mechanics. Galante doesn't survive through sentiment. He survives through repetition. Every time a runner is instructed to never meet his supplier's eyes, every time a stash house is kept off lease, every time a phone call is never made, there he is, not speaking, not even watching, just there. Ask the last few old-timers still sitting on stoops in Bensonhurst. Ask them what scared them most back then. The Colombians? The feds? The rats? No, they'll say. It was the possibility that Carmine already knew. There's something deeply unnerving about a man who never yells, who never threatens, who walks into a room and makes the temperature drop, not with theatrics, but with awareness. Galante was never feared for what he said. He was feared for what he didn't. In silence like that, it lingers. In recent years, some fiction writers have tried to fictionalize him, give him a fake name, a new city, a different trade. But it doesn't stick. Because Galante wasn't a character. He was a constant. In a genre filled with wild cards, he was the blueprint everyone copied without admitting it. Even in popular media, you can see traces. A quiet boss here, a logistics kingpin there. They dress him up in new accents, new cities, new shadows. But the bones? All his. And perhaps that's the strangest victory of all. To become so effective that even storytellers can invent something better. Meanwhile, back in the real world, the last bit of paperwork tied to his estate finally disappears. A property title in Williamsburg, long contested, is sold quietly to a development group. They plan to turn it into condos, of course, but during renovation, something odd is found in the wall behind the boiler. An old envelope, sealed in wax. Inside, a short note, handwritten. "If you found this, you looked too hard." No signature, just a faint outline where a cigar had been set down on paper. The workers laughed. The foreman kept it. No one could explain why. But everyone agreed on one thing. It felt like he meant it. So what do you think? Was Galante simply a man of his time, well suited to an era of shadows? Or did he build something that outlasted the era itself? Because even as the world moved on, digital crime, global networks, cashless corruption, his design remains valid, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clean, efficient, unsentimental, a machine without rust. In a final twist of irony, a young tech entrepreneur, raised in Queens, fluent in blockchain, oblivious to history, starts a company offering invisible logistics to luxury clients. He names it Galante. He says he thought it sounded expensive. Someone tells him the name's history. He shrugs, keeps it, because it fits. Because even now, even accidentally, the name moves product. And that's legacy. Night falls easy over East Harlem these days. The old corners, once heavy with whispers and folded newspapers exchanged at just the right moment, now hum with gentrified wine bars and yoga studios. A man could walk 100 blocks and not hear a name like Carmine Galante spoken aloud, but underneath it all, under the concrete, under the city's new rhythms, the bones of his empire remain, not in men, not even in memory, in motion, because systems, when designed well enough, don't announce their endurance. They just keep operating, unnoticed, undisturbed, unimpressed by the passage of time. Galante understood that, maybe better than anyone. He didn't build for visibility. He built for invisibility. And that's why, to this day, there are things moving in this world, unrelated by blood or badge or oath, that still reflect his geometry. A pattern of separation, a diagram of control, and always, the absence of noise. You might find it in the silent passage of cargo through lesser-known ports in the Adriatic. You might catch it in the way financial accounts disappear 3 levels deep in a Belizean shell firm. No names, no heat, no chaos, just the quiet hum of engineered risk reduction. The kind of crime that doesn't spike heart rates because it doesn't fail. There's a line, buried in a forgotten FBI surveillance log from 1978. 2 agents listening in on a dinner conversation. One man says to the other, chuckling, "Carmine says if you have to raise your voice, you've already lost the argument." That line didn't make it into any reports, but it made it into memory. And that, again, is the Galante fingerprint, the unspoken lesson, the rule passed sideways between whispers, still shaping behavior long after the man who authored it is gone. Even in global criminal think tanks, his name is brought up not as a figure to fear, but as an architect to study, an early adopter of modular design, of operational silence, of human insulation. He didn't need 100 men in the street. He needed 4, placed correctly. He didn't need a spotlight. He needed a window with a view, and he got it. Even when the view ended with bullets and blood, the echo of his structure rolled on, because what Galante created was a system that anticipated failure and kept moving anyway. A machine that didn't weep when a cog broke. It just rerouted. Today, in a high-security prison somewhere in upstate New York, an aging capo teaches the young ones. Not about power, not about fear, but about the rules Galante lived by. Don't speak unless you're listening. Don't touch what you can move through others. Don't leave fingerprints when a shadow will do. He ends the lesson with a pause. Then he lights a cigar, not to smoke it, but to feel the weight of it between his fingers. That too is legacy. And what of the man himself? There's no shrine, no statue, just a plot in St. John's Cemetery in Queens. No flowers, no fresh coins, just a stone that says Carmine Galante and the dates that bracketed the storm. But if you stand there long enough, if you really listen, you might hear something. Not a voice, not even a memory, just a breeze, carrying the scent of tobacco and a silence that feels like it's still making decisions. So what do you think? Was he just another ghost in the long corridor of American crime? Or was he the hallway itself? Either way, the doors he built, still closed, still locked, still waiting for someone who understands how to knock. And now, dear listener, the final ember fades. The last sip of espresso settles cold in its cup, and the evening, quiet and endless, lays its hand gently over the city Galante once held in his palm. His story, like his cigar, burned slowly, cleanly, leaving behind only the faintest trace of smoke curling toward a ceiling that never blinked. The streets may have changed, but the hush he left behind remains. Let your breath slow now. Let the weight of names and codes and whispered orders drift into the backdrop like a final closing door. This was never just about crime. It was about control. Silent, certain, and absolute. In this moment, you don't need to chase the shadow. You've followed it well enough. Let the systems quiet. Let the echoes settle. Imagine the glow of a patio light behind a shuttered restaurant. Imagine the warmth of a July night that never ended. Imagine a man sitting still, unmoved by fear or time, watching the world turn without rushing to meet it. And know that, for a while, you were sitting beside him. So rest now. You've earned it. The story is complete. And the silence, well, it's working.